At one point, I had the sensation that I was drowning. And I say that only because the light was above me and I didn't have a body. So very similar to like when you're in a dream and you go to run or swing or punch and you can't. I wanted to like swim up towards the light and everything was contained in that light. Our language is so woefully inadequate to begin to describe what I felt. We use words like unconditional love and universal love and energy and God and source and universe. And it's so much more than any one of those could ever even begin to touch.
This is Andrew Petty is Dying, where we tap into the power of our mortality to become the people we were made to be and live the lives we were made to live. I'm your host, Andrew Petty, and I'm dying. I hate to say it, but so are you. What's on the other side of death? Danielle Slupesky came face to face with her own mortality through a harrowing and prolonged medical crisis. She barely lived to tell the tale. In the midst of that crisis, she had a near-death experience that completely changed the trajectory of her life and her relationship with death. Danielle is an end-of-life coach and a death doula based out of Albuquerque, New Mexico. In this episode, she gives us a detailed first-hand account of her near-death experience and how it changed her. Frankly, it's difficult to know where to file or categorize Danielle's experience. On the one hand, it would be reassuring if it fit neatly into my existing worldview or further supported it. But it doesn't do that. So for now, it gets filed under unsolved mysteries. It's clear, though, that what remains a mystery to me has radically transformed Danielle. Its impact cannot be ignored. For that reason alone, her story is worth paying attention to. But there's more to Danielle's story that deserves our attention, including the importance of surrender, the perils of unconscious living, and how our bodies whisper messages that we need to hear and heed. This conversation enlightened, challenged, and encouraged me. I hope it does the same for you. Let's jump in. Danielle, your story has a dramatic before and after. What were you like before your encounter with mortality? And how are you different after it?
That's a really great question. I think the quickest, simplest way to answer it is that my husband now refers to every once in a while, quote unquote, nurse Danielle comes out. I was an emergency trauma nurse. That required a certain level of tough skin to be put on, a certain layer of a shell, being harder than I really was, tougher than I really was. I saw vulnerability as weakness. I saw showing emotion as weakness. All of those things are gone. And I now view things that I used to view as weaknesses as the utmost of strength. So I think that's probably the quickest summation of that, is that things that I used to view as weaknesses are the exact opposite now.
So vulnerability equals strength now, as opposed to vulnerability equaling weakness beforehand and all of those kinds of things. How did you live before your encounter with mortality? How did you approach life? How did you spend your time? How did you invest your time?
I was very much in a place where I was getting by. I was following everyone else's ideas of what life was supposed to be, how it was supposed to go. You know, you should be married at a certain time. You should have kids by this age, all of that stuff. And I completely denied all of my own traumas, all of my own hurts and pains, and chose to kind of get around all of those things or get through all of those things by helping other people, right? Putting myself last. I put the focus on everyone and everything other than myself. And in that getting through, I was living extremely unconsciously. I was keeping up with my peers. I mean, I wasn't crazy out of the realm of what was going on, but we were partying all the time. You know, I mean, we would very frequently get off work at 7 a.m. after a tough shift, hit the local restaurant that was nearby, and we'd all be ordering cocktails at 7 a.m, you know, with the idea that we just got off work, right? That's totally acceptable. I also have a lot of chronic health stuff that started even in childhood. And so I think my first narcotic prescription was given to me at 11. So very quickly that became a background crutch that was just always there, that I didn't view as a problem at the time. But looking back, I was a full-blown, high-functioning opiate addict and alcoholic. I used those things as crutches. So that's how I was living beforehand, you know?
Yeah. And what does unconscious living mean to you? Can you tease that out a little bit more?
I can.
As compared and contrasted with conscious living.
So for me, that looked like eating out very often. And if we weren't eating out, it was, what can I pull out of the freezer and throw into the microwave or the oven real quick to get quote unquote food on the table. Sleep was a low priority. It was more important to finish my binge on Netflix than to give my body adequate time and space for rest. It was denying my own emotions and my own thoughts and feelings and everything, really. It was just constant distracting behaviors. Anything and everything came from external sources because what was inside was scary. I couldn't have told you that at the time. I wasn't aware of it because, again, I was unconscious of it. And so now, in contrast, it's very different, right? Like, all of our meals are fresh. I very, very rarely do we eat out. Do we eat something frozen? I roast a couple of chickens a week and then make bone broth, and then the bones get ground down for the dog food. I garden, I journal, I meditate. We're in bed by 9:30 and I'm up between 5:30 and 6 every morning without an alarm now, which I thought was insane before. I'd be in bed at midnight and be crying when my alarm went off to get up, So I guess in those ways, and that's what I mean when I say unconscious living.
You're not unusual, I don't think, in that unconscious living in our Western culture. You had your own particular set of circumstances in your own life story that influenced you in particular ways to lead you to certain behaviors in your life. But with the benefit, well, we'll say capital B benefit, of having encountered mortality and had the opportunity to evolve a bit, what do you see now as some of the common factors that we, especially Westerners, share that lead us to that unconscious living that I and the listeners could begin to see more clearly and change even without the benefit of a crisis to clarify and focus for us? That's a long question, but
it was a long question. and it's a big one, right? Like, it needs to be broken down into like bite-sized pieces. Like you've said, we all have a story, right? Like, everybody has their reasons for ending up in that kind of samsara, unconscious living cycle of...
What was that word? Samsara? What is that?
Samsara?
Yeah, what's that?
I believe it's a Buddhist term. It's basically like being stuck in the wheel of life. Like Ram Dass referred to it as the marketplace. It's like the external 3D world of stuff. Mm-hmm. And kind of being stuck and wrapped up in all of that. And we all have whatever our story is that gets us there. For me, I think the big change comes in how you view yourself within that story. And what I mean by that is when I identify with my role as Danielle within this life story, things can seem really overwhelming and really hard and really tough. But if I can pull out of that and identify with myself as a soul, outside of that, the person behind the eyes, the being that is powering the vehicle that is my body, that's a completely different perspective shift, right? And it changes how I interact with everyone and everything in my sphere. So for me, it's all about the perspective of why. What's the point of the story? What are we doing here? Making meaning out of our traumas, making meaning out of our hiccups along the way. The things that we view as failure may very well turn out to be some of our biggest assets later. Like, for example, for years, I was really down on myself for not using my nursing license, feeling like I'd wasted this, right? I wasted time, money, effort, went and got this bachelor's degree. And when we were living in the Virgin Islands, I was cleaning houses for a living, and as I'm scrubbing someone's toilet, it's like, what am I doing with my life? But I loved it and I was enjoying what I was doing. But it was this constant guilt and shame. And now I just recently helped a family a couple of weeks ago in the ICU withdraw life support from their husband and father. And I was able to speak the language to the doctors and nurses and explain everything happening to the family. And in that moment, it was so clear to me that I was never meant to be a nurse. I was never meant to stop there. That thing that I once viewed as failure was exactly where I needed to be. And it was a stepping stone to get me to the end result of being this advocate now at the patient bedside. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but...
I like where you're headed. I like all of that.
Okay, well, thank you.
Well, what I gleaned was if we can achieve a little bit of separation between the human form moving through the world and the spirit animating that human form, and acknowledge that spirit, that soul, that animating force has purpose and direction in the world, then it can help us to live more consciously. Am I connecting those dots well?
Yes, absolutely.
Maybe I'll personalize it a little bit more and just ask, what are you aware of that you're willing to share with us that was leading you to live unconsciously? And what in hindsight do you think you could have done any differently without having had the benefit of this like jolt of an encounter with mortality to shake you awake? Was there an opportunity for you to live more consciously prior?
There absolutely were. And when I think back on that, for me, everything has been very physical. And I mean that like physically in my body. My body kind of is my barometer for every other part of me, you know, mental, emotional, spiritual, all of that stuff. And from a very young age, there were always these chronic kind of non-specific medical things that didn't fit for someone my age. Headaches and kindergarten kind of thing, you know, coming home from school and putting myself to bed early, things like that most children don't do. And I now realize that for years and years and years, my body was whispering, and it was trying to tell me that there were things that needed to be dealt with and processed and handled and loved on, you know, parts of me that had been kind of disjointed through trauma. You know, they needed to be reintegrated and pulled back in and loved on. If I had had different support in my life at a younger age, it could have been helpful and it could have been beneficial. But I don't know that I had the ears to hear it until I did, you know. And I admit I am extremely stubborn. I'm pretty hard-headed. I am one of those that like, okay, sure, that worked for you. That's great. But I need to feel it. I need to experience it. You know, and I always tell people like wisdom is for the mind. You can read something or someone can explain something to you, and that's intellectual knowledge, but experience is for the body. And my near-death experience solidified things within me and into my body, into my cells that I cannot deny, you know, that I cannot discount. So I'd love to say that, yes, I had the opportunity beforehand, but I don't know if I ever would have gotten there, honestly.
Yeah. Well, that really resonates with me. I feel similarly about the parts of my story up until this point that have been pivotal, where I was sort of shaken out of a stupor of sorts into greater consciousness and awareness of what was really going on. And, you know, I had a lot of stupid coping behaviors, you know, that were mentally and physically destructive for a bunch of years as I was battling with the anxiety. And, you know, I always say that those were certainly my choices. I am responsible for the choices I made. And I don't know what I could have done differently, because each page in that chapter of my story was leading to climactic events that appeared to have needed to occur for me, which is not excusing any of my dumb behaviors along the way, but it's also attributing some meaning to them in creating the greater levels of clarity that I now experience. So it's a very interesting question. I mean, it's one maybe we'll just have to wait till we shuffle off this mortal coil and get to interact with, you know, our higher power and figure out what the heck's going on there. But there's some mystery. There's some mystery there.
There is. I've always say that while I would never choose to go back, you know, and go through that, honestly, year of hell in the hospital, all the surgeries and all of this stuff. I would never choose to go through each of those experiences again. But if you gave me the opportunity to just kind of erase them, I would say absolutely not. You know, no way. There's so much value in all of it. So many lessons learned. None of the traumas, none of the pain, none of the hurts would I take away.
Well, it's beautiful to see now how, as you mentioned earlier, you're able to serve people at the bedside in ways that you wouldn't have been able to had your story not transpired in the way that it has so far. Now, who scripted that? That's a great question. You certainly didn't script that. In fact, there are ways in which you were resisting the story that was unfolding in your life, and yet that story is now of great value and benefit and service to many other people. Wow. Well,
and to kind of expand on that, I mean, that kind of resisting, it continued. So the hospitalization and near-death experience happened in 2013. In October of 2014, my husband and I moved down to the Virgin Islands, went right back to the same kind of unconscious living, partying, living like we were on vacation, having a great time. In my mind, I had logicked, for lack of a real word, all of those experiences away, right? I was a nurse. I was hallucinating. I was hypovolemic. I was low on oxygen. Like I was on all these meds, you know, I was in the ICU. Like they'll fade over time. It will go away kind of thing. And not only did it not fade over time, but I say I came back different. And what I mean by that is I'm extremely more sensitive than I was. I intuit much more. I feel more from other people, and can kind of feel their emotions and energies in ways that I didn't before. And so that kind of going back to the unconscious living was another form of a coping mechanism, because I didn't know how to handle all of this kind of literally extra sensory stuff, things that I did not sense before that were now happening to me. And so, I resisted it for a long time until about 2018. Right before that, in 2017, we got hit with Hurricanes Irma and Maria back to back on St. Croix. Well, the whole Caribbean. We all kind of heard about Puerto Rico, but the Virgin Islands were in the path before Puerto Rico got hit. So on St. Croix, after Maria, we didn't have power for 67 days in our home. And because we have a cistern with a water pump, that meant we didn't have running water either. Lots of mold grew on everything afterwards, and I got really sick again. And I kind of had this real rock bottom moment of, okay, look, I've been through some stuff already, and this was supposed to be like our island paradise, our getaway, our early retirement, all of those things. And now here we are again facing major stuff. I got incredibly sick. Eventually ended up being diagnosed with Lyme disease and toxic mold and heavy metal stuff, all this crazy stuff. And it finally forced me to sit down and be like, what am I not getting? I've already had the 2x4 upside the head. What am I missing here? And that forced me down this whole spiritual path of meditation and mindfulness and breath work and working with a therapist and plant medicine. And all of these different modalities. And the end result was you're not following what you said you were going to come back here to do. And it was kind of like, whoa, all of that was really real. If I'm going to be okay here, meaning here on earth, in this existence, I have to honor that stuff. I have to honor this calling. And so I came home and I Googled death coach because I didn't know a death doula was a thing. And the Conscious Dying Institute website popped up. And when it did, and this is kind of one of those extra things I'm talking about, like not only goosebumps over my whole body, but my head felt like, those little glass electric balls that the kids will play with and you can touch it and zaps everywhere. My whole head felt like that. Like literally my scalp was just electrified, it felt like. So much I pulled my hands off the keyboard and said aloud to the room, okay, this is the thing. Found it, got it. And immediately took their course and kind of hit the ground running ever since. So lots of resistance, I guess, was the point of going into that whole diving into the thing.
I'm so glad you shared that because the before and after that I'm able to gather from reading about you online and little conversations we've had was, you were unconscious living, doing the nursing life, and then you have this experience and boom, freshly out of this experience, you were launched into a new trajectory. And that's a very different tale you've just told us, about 4 years of really escaping again. And it reminds me of you're sort of a modern day Jonah and the whale. God came and told Jonah to go tell these foreigners that they needed to shape up or ship out. And Jonah's like, no, thanks. I'm going to go the other direction. And, God puts him through hell until finally Jonah says, fine. Okay, good. I'll do it. Fine. And it reminds me very much of that because God just kept giving you an offer that was very difficult for you to refuse until eventually you relented and you accepted sort of the mandate that your story, and I think in terms of God, that God was calling you to. You accepted your calling. It reminds me of the hero's journey too. There's this call to adventure, and you were, through your near-death experience, which I hope you'll be willing to share more about in just a minute, you were apparently given some call to fulfill, and you resisted for another 4 years. And then events conspired to bring you to that keyboard on that day, and you finally accepted the call to adventure, and then it went from the realm of the status quo into the realm of the unknown, uncertainty, and a new part of your adventure. And I imagine in some ways you feel like you're still there, trying to figure out how do I fulfill this calling that my life story has foisted upon me. And you've now, with much resistance, decided to accept. So many cool things happening in your story that I love to be able to highlight for myself and for the listener, because it's just encouraging to know that we're all part of this bigger story, and each of us have our own story within it, and there's purpose in our stories. And what's more, there's purpose in our pain. And I would never say that to someone in the midst of suffering, because that would be premature and immature and and uncaring to do. But we can know as we distance ourselves from our own experiences of pain and see how they play out that there really is purpose in pain, especially to the degree that we're willing to work with it and work through it. Would you be willing to share something about your near-death experience? I mean, it sounds like in addition to just your prolonged encounter with mortality and the uncertainty that went along with the outcome from that experience, it sounds like there was something specific that happened during that time that was especially transformational.
There was. For just kind of a quick synopsis background, I had been out with a group of girlfriends, a bunch of nurses. We were out drinking, having a great time in San Francisco. Got a limo and we were bouncing around to, different drag bars and shows and having a great time. I drank way too much, got out of the limo and my heel caught on the door sill coming out. I came down on the curb on my knee. Ended up with a non-displaced fracture of my left femur. But it required immobilization for 8 weeks. So I was sitting around with my leg tied up. Ended up developing a blood clot in that leg. Didn't know I had. It moved to my lungs because I came home from my nursing shift in pain and exhausted. And I'd already alluded to all of my addictions and, poor coping mechanisms. I took a handful of pills as I normally did to go to sleep. And when that clot then traveled and I passed out in the bathroom, I passed out in such a way that my head was inside the tub and my legs were outside of it. So it was cutting circulation off to my legs and my abdomen. When you don't have circulation to muscles for a long period of time, those muscles die. That protein is released into the blood and it clogs up the kidneys. So now I'm in kidney failure and I have this big blood clot. So fast forward several days into the ICU admission, and a resident decided she was going to help relieve some of the pressure in my chest cavity from all of this fluid overload, and attempted a procedure she shouldn't have and perforated my bowels instead.
Holy smoke. Yeah,
now I'm leaking stool into my abdomen over the next 2 days, become completely septic before they realize what's happening, get me to the OR and open me up. And I mean, there's just free floating stool everywhere, abscesses. They do a bunch of bowel resection, 3 major surgeries in the first 36 hours to just try to keep me alive kind of thing. Somewhere in there, I think it was maybe 7 or 10 days after the most recent major abdominal surgery, they needed to restart the blood thinning medicine to get rid of the clot. When that happened, my abdominal wound bled out.
I'm familiar with that. My wife was on blood thinners for both C-sections, and we had complications post-surgery. I'm very familiar with that, unfortunately. Wow.
So then we ended up with a huge, open wound and a washout and a wound vac. And what I was left with at home was basically my large intestine sticking out directly below my sternum. My small intestine was directly above my pubic bone, and there was a big hole in the middle with the wound vac, which is a machine that kind of helps suck out constant wound fluid stuff. So I say all of that because there were multiple episodes in the hospital where they called a code, or they needed to re-intubate me because I was crashing again. Same thing happened in the OR. So I don't know at what point in this world these events happened.
Mm-hmm.
And from my perspective, everything happened simultaneously, right? Like linear time ceased to exist. So it felt like all of these events were just everything, everywhere, all at once, right? Just like the movie. So 2 major important things. At one point, I had the sensation that I was drowning. And I say that only because the light was above me and I didn't have a body. So very similar to like when you're in a dream and you go to run or swing or punch and you can't. I wanted to like swim up towards the light, but I couldn't. And everything was contained in that light. Our language is so woefully inadequate to begin to describe what I felt. We use words like unconditional love and universal love and energy and God and source and universe. And it's so much more than any one of those could ever even begin to touch.
Can I ask a quick question?
Mm-hmm.
What emotions are you experiencing even as you describe and recall that experience?
It's overwhelming. When I call up that sensation, it genuinely just feels like more than the human body can contain. And so I get emotional, my chest tightens up, I start to tear up, and it's a combination of a lot of things. It's love, it's excitement, it's anticipation, it's homesickness. There's a big element of that Because after feeling and experiencing that, and then coming back here, where you kind of come back to separation, and you don't feel that complete connected.
Sort of like the Matrix.
Yes, exactly. And so there's a big element of homesickness to what I feel when I think about that time. So yeah, I think those are the biggest things that come up. And also, so when I had always heard about it or thought about it before and pictured the light, I always thought about like a train headlight, or a flashlight beam, like this really bright, intense tunnel of light, and it wasn't that at all. It was much more like when you're swimming in a pool or a lake or the ocean and you're 10 or 15 feet below the water and you look up and you know right where the sun is. You see the focal point, but it's diffuse and sparkly around the edges. Like it was not a harsh beam at all. It was very soft. But again, I just felt like I couldn't get into it all the way, and that's where I knew I needed to be. And so at some other point, I find myself, and again, I didn't have a body. I wasn't Danielle, but I was me. What I experienced felt very mechanical, which also I had never heard about prior to my experience. And so I describe it like an old Kodak, like a slide projector, where somebody would show their old family vacation photos.
Yeah.
And it like each individual one is facing
on the carousel. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. I'm in the middle of the carousel, and each one of those where the slide picture would be is simultaneously a photo that I can look at. It's like a 3D movie that I can watch third person. I'm also in it as me, experiencing it as myself again. They're all scenes from my life. It's a complete life review. But I'm not just experiencing it from my perspective. It's from the perspective of everyone else in the scene as well. And I didn't even put that together until fairly recently, that it was like, oh my gosh, I was completely omniscient. I was able to feel everyone's emotions, hear everyone's thoughts, and not just in that moment, but it's like I had access to everything that got them to that moment, and some access to the things that happened to them after that moment. And so, for example, there was a scene with a girl that I never would have remembered. We're talking first, second grade, somewhere in there. And I was kind of that kid that didn't really have a group. I didn't have a clique. I just kind of bounced around. And this little girl was getting bullied by the group of, popular kind of mean girls. And I stood in between them and kind of shamed these other girls and stood up for this one. And there were these 3 girls, and I'll never forget what it felt like in that moment to feel what it felt like for this girl to be stood up for, to have someone see her and her pain and not allow it, and how that changed her. Sorry, I get geek every time. How that changed her both in the moment and then forever thereafter. And I felt what it felt like to be shamed from these other girls' perspective, and it just forever, that entire experience, right? Like there were so many different scenes from my life, ones that I would have considered completely inconsequential and had no conscious memory of. But I can't ever forget that. And now every interaction I have with another human, I am extremely aware of the impact of my words, of my energy, of my touch, of my presence or lack thereof, of my eye contact, all of it. Because every interaction we have with any other human has the potential to change the rest of their lives. And that sounds super, cliche, like cheesy, whatever, but it does. And it does. I've experienced it. And so it was all of these scenes. And at first it started off kind of slowly, where they would kind of click over almost from one to the next. And I had an opportunity to experience and be with each one. And then it started spinning faster and faster. And as it did, everything just kind of blended together. And it felt like the overarching theme, if you will, was compassion and connection. And like, that's the whole point, for me at least, for this go around, for this lifetime, for what I'm supposed to be doing in every way that I can possibly show it, in every interaction possible. It's compassion and connection. And so as this thing is spinning faster and faster, I had just this knowing Again, I didn't speak to any other beings. There weren't angels. There wasn't, I didn't have any other interaction besides with myself, but I just knew that as I was being sucked upwards, if I crossed this like invisible threshold of this apparatus, that there's no coming back, that was it. In that, I recognized that I had a choice. And so in the moment that I recognized I had a choice, I knew that meant I had to get back into my body, which I was really not happy about.
You made a choice that you knew you needed to make but didn't want to make. There was some sense of it's important for you to get back in your body as opposed to go through that barrier.
Correct. Yes. And the reason for that at that time for me was 100% my husband. We'd only been married 1.5 years at that point.
Wow. Happy first 1.5 years of marriage, huh?
Yeah.
My goodness.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yes. It was very new. So he was 25, I think, at the time. Yeah, 25, and I was 30. I knew that he would not be okay if I left under these circumstances. He hadn't left the hospital. I think we're probably about a month into the hospitalization at this point, and he hadn't left. I mean, he'd lost weight. He wasn't showering. He stunk. He wasn't eating. And finally, his brother had convinced him to go home, and the two of them shared a bottle of Jack Daniels and got hammered, and he was passed out. So when my girlfriend, another nurse that was there with me, calling and texting him and like, dude, you got to get back here. Like, this is bad. Like, this is probably it. You need to come back. He wasn't there. And so the last like conscious thought I had before I passed out and, everything continues to happen was I can't go like this. It's like I knew I was going to, and I was completely okay and comfortable with that, but I knew that he would not be okay. Like I had to at least say goodbye. And so from my perspective, when I had this thought, like, no, I have to get back in my body. I have to at least say goodbye to him. He has to know that I'm going. And kind of to come back to that getting into my body, you don't know it's not just discomfort. There's a level of pain that comes along with being in a physical container that you don't recognize until you have an opportunity to be outside of that physical container. Ram Dass has said it like dying is like taking off an old shoe or a too tight shoe. And my grandmother describes it like being shoved in a mayonnaise jar. And it is very similar to that. Like after being that huge and expansive and all knowing, and to come back and like be confined to human senses is a challenge at times. But so I knew I had to get back in the body. I knew I couldn't cross this threshold. And so I had the thought, I want off, as if it was like some sort of a ride. And as this thing was spinning faster and faster, I shoved my arm, which still doesn't make sense to me because I didn't have a body, but like I wanted to jam the gears, right? It felt very mechanical. I'm like, nope, I'm jamming this up. I'm going to break it. So that's what's happening from my perspective. And in this world, at this point, I'm re-intubated. I'm not responding. I hadn't responded to doctors or nurses at this point. And then my husband shows up and he gets there and, starts yelling in my ear and squeeze my hand, and I squeeze his hand. So from my side, when I shove my arm through this spinning gear apparatus thing, we have like this cliffhanger hand moment where like I feel him and he pulls me through back into my body.
Wow.
And so I don't know if that's actually the moment that it all happened. Like, I don't know, but that's how I perceived it. And that's what happened from my side. So it was intense, right? Like it taught me so much. It taught me that, like I said, compassion and connection is of the utmost importance. It's kind of the entire point to me that I am so much more than my physical body, that I no longer now identify with it any more than my car sitting out on the street. It's a vehicle that gets me around. Now, if I want it to be a top performing, Ferrari, Lamborghini, great vehicle, I have to treat it as such, right? So it's kind of an and or where I know that I'm more than my body, but it also made me respect it in ways that I never did before, because I recognize its value and its importance. And, we only get one of them while we're here. We got to take care of it.
That's refreshing, I think, to hear, because I think there are some philosophies that would lead you to almost disdain the mortal coil, to minimize or be dismissive of it, because we are celestial beings ultimately. And this, these rags are to be tolerated. And it's actually refreshing for me to hear that while your relationship with your physical form changed, your regard for its well-being increased.
Absolutely. 100%. I mean, like I spoke of earlier, what I view as much more conscious living now. Like I said, we take sleep really importantly. That's of utmost importance. Our food as medicine now, instead of rushing immediately to pharmaceuticals, and exercise and breath work and all of these things that like I genuinely believed I didn't have time for, quote unquote, when I was so wrapped up in my little unconscious life. And yeah, all of those now I view as literally, it's a privilege. It's a privilege to be able to go exercise. Not everyone has that. Like you've had people on your show with one complete limb. I'm sure that guy would really love to go out and take a run. And there I was sitting on the couch like, oh, that's too much effort. Hand me the remote, And so it completely changed all of that. Where now it's like, it's a privilege to cook myself a good meal. There are people out there that live in food deserts that don't have access to vegetables. And here I am trying to pull something out of the freezer, so it changed all of that.
Thank you so much for sharing what was a very personal and probably in many ways almost indescribable experience. I mean, you lived it. So for you, the experience is almost maybe as much emotional and physical in terms of sensations, and words, like you said before, really fail. But thanks for making a great effort. And that really was powerful to hear. And I'm jealous almost of that experience. Not, of course, of the things that led to it, but my goodness, what an experience. You said, and I think your website or somewhere I saw, you said, these events taught me the sweet art of surrender, instilled in me an incredibly deep sense of compassion and empathy, and completely negated any fears of death I had prior. Clearly, watershed, capital W to the nth degree times infinity in terms of how you live now and how you view life and how you view death.
Absolutely. Surrender. That's a big word. We tend to view it in our Western society as, again, like some sort of weakness, or it almost has a negative connotation, right? Like we don't want to surrender to anything. And so we get really good at developing our constriction muscles and our, paddling upstream muscles and all of that stuff. And I really try to get people to think of the idea of we have surrender muscles and we need to strengthen them. And it is a skill to learn how to surrender. Surrender to the moment, surrender to an emotion, surrender to what reality actually is. And when we can get ourselves to that place, acceptance is right behind, right? Like, and that's kind of the goal where we want to get people, no matter what we're talking about, acceptance of what really is. So yeah, surrender is a big one for me. For a big part of me being in the hospital, my blood pressure was too low to sedate me at all. So I was intubated with no sedation. So to allow a machine to breathe for you, and because if you fight the vent or try to breathe over it or around it, it hurts. It's very painful. And I mean, I can't think of any further, like bigger amount of surrender that a human can do, but to give up your breathing to something outside of you. And so, yeah, learning that I think was huge in helping people at the bedside at end of life, and knowing the right words and things to say to get people to that place, because it's really beautiful when you can get to that surrender spot. It really is magic.
Well, and it's so cool that as you help people transition from this life into whatever comes next, that you've had an opportunity to experience some of what apparently comes next. And so you're not a begrudging guide into that reality. You're a very willing and grateful participant in helping them to get there.
Absolutely. And I think one of the biggest challenges of what I have to do is to hold equally at the same time the absolute joy I feel for the person that's leaving, with the pain and the grief and the reverence and sadness that I exhibit for those and feel for those left behind. But that's my job, and I do both at once. And so figuring out how to do that and how to provide others of an example of how to do that and that it's possible is so insanely rewarding and humbling. I had a woman, so I work with MAID patients, so medical aid in dying patients. And so these are people that have chosen, their day and time to exit this world because they already have a terminal illness, right? And she and I had a ton of opportunity to sit and talk for days leading up to this. And she asked about my story and I shared it with her. And, I got emotional like I did with you because I can't help it. It's every time it comes up. And she looks at me, and this is an 87-year-old woman, and she's like, I've been in church my whole life. I have been preached at, I've been preached to. And she goes, I've never believed anyone like I believe you. She goes, because you can feel it, you see it. This was real for you. I'm like, absolutely. And just being able to share that with her, she left with anticipation and excitement and curiosity, as opposed to anxiety and trepidation and fear, Those moments are, it's like, oh, that's why I went through that year of hell. That's why I've had all of these experiences, to get, even if it's just that one person and that one moment to that place. It really is amazing.
Well, thank you for surrendering to that calling and for the ministry of compassion and connection and liberation that you're offering to families who are losing their loved one and to the one who's dying. I mean, that is a tremendous service, and that's too small a word, but thank you for surrendering to your calling and following it wherever it leads. That's a sacred role to fill. That's a good transition, I think, to share with our listeners and for me to learn more about what your end-of-life coaching work is about and what being a death doula is all about. And I'm especially curious about your perspective on what role death doulas fill in modern Western culture that was needed. So wherever you'd like to start there, share with us some about that.
I put a little bit of a distinction between end-of-life coaching and death doula work. And that comes from my training. There's actually 2 separate certifications there. And so end-of-life coaching, just like life coaching, can be a huge catalyst for change in somebody's life. And contrary to the name, the earlier, younger, healthier you are when you go through the process, the more beneficial it will be, right? You have more life thereafter to be affected by the process. And so we dive into 5 domains of life. So mental, which is like your life legacy, your life review and your life story, putting together legacy projects, writing letters, things like that. Then emotional, which is very relational, right? Like, what's your relationship like been to yourself over your life? A lot of the stuff I've talked about earlier, and I wasn't happy with the relationship I had with myself, and I needed to make some major changes. When relationships with other people, are there relationships in your life that you need to nurture or reconcile before you leave? Spiritually, where do you believe you're going to go when you die? What do you think happens to you? Do you have specific religious or spiritual practices that we need to honor? And if you're completely secular and atheist even, I worked with a family just recently, no spiritual beliefs whatsoever, described themselves as atheists, and yet we still created ritual surrounding their loved one's death that they can then honor later. Like, right, I think in our society, we've kind of made ritual or ceremony synonymous with religion, and it turns some people off, and it doesn't need to be. So there we have mental, emotional, spiritual, and then physical, kind of like creating a birth plan. It's just like creating a birth plan. And in creating a birth plan, right, everything could go wrong and you have an emergency C-section, but just the process of writing said plan forces you to research your options, find out things that are available to you that you didn't even know were a thing. And it's empowering. So we kind of create a death plan, your ideal, what sounds do you want in the room? What scents? Do you like essential oils, or do you want a scented candle? Do you live in the woods somewhere where it's really important to you to keep the window open so you can smell the pine trees? Who do you want at your bedside? Where do you want to be? Most people say they want to die at home, and yet 2/3 of us die in hospitals and facilities. If we plan ahead of time, we can prevent that. And then from a practical perspective, everything from your DNR and your advanced directives and things like that, the legal stuff, to do you want your family and I to wash your body and redress you before the mortuary comes? Do you want a green burial? Are you interested in body composting? It's education and guidance surrounding all of those options. And so we come up with an ideal death vision and then a map of taking the steps to get there. And very often we find, like when we dive into the emotional stuff, we recognize, we're not exactly where we want to be and we need to change some things for the rest of the time we're here. Same thing with the legacy or life review, If we were to die today, will people remember us the way we want to be remembered? And if not, how do we change that? So that's kind of the end of life coaching. And then the death doula work. So death doulas are frontline caregivers that work alongside, not as a substitute for, hospice and palliative care. So with hospice and palliative care, you get a doctor and a nurse and a CNA and a social worker and a chaplain and this amazing team of people. But just like everything else in our Western medicine model at the moment, those resources are stretched really thin. You may get your nurse for an hour once or twice a week until the very end, where you might see her for an hour once a day. Hospice does not provide 24-hour care. Many people don't know that. The chaplain may have the opportunity to see you once or twice a month. So there's all of this other time. There are all of these other things besides just the physical, besides just your diagnosis that need to be dealt with and processed. And that's what death doulas do. For example, I was working with a woman and her family last year, another MAID patient. She had ALS, and so she chose to participate in MAID and plan her death. Her favorite flowers were daffodils. We couldn't get daffodils in October, but I put together bags, like favor bags almost, of daffodil bulbs with instructions on planting them and a poem about, how daffodils symbolize hope and rebirth. And as I'm laid to rest, and put these in the ground this fall. And when we pop up next spring, it's time to kind of shift our mourning process and all of that. And so death doulas do things like that, right? We bring in ceremony and ritual and can kind of be viewed almost as an event planner, for the event of dying. Barbara Carnes is a really well-known death educator, hospice nurse, and I love it. She says that death is not a medical event. Death is a communal event, right? And so they're just like all the other major communal events we have in our lives. We have preparation leading up to. Very often we have experts and guides to help us with that preparation. And that's what death doulas do. We come in and we're that person, that event planner, that coordinator, that guidance and education and support.
Well, I love that. And the word humanity comes to mind. Just you're bringing humanity and creativity, I think, even into that dying process where, you came up with the idea of the daffodils to be planted. And when the process of death can be so filled with only medical necessities and difficult medical decision making, and to introduce beauty, I think, back into the dying process. What a gift. And that really calls to me. And I want my wife and I to summon the courage to go ahead and go through, that very detailed planning process. And I'm curious, my assumption is that, it can be a form of rite of passage for people who aren't yet actively dying to go ahead and plan for their death, that it can be a rite of passage. You said, in fact, that when we bring our mortality into the forefront of our awareness and begin planning for a conscious death, we automatically begin to lead more conscious lives. And that was my assumption, that would in fact be the case. And you're finding that to be true.
Absolutely. Right? Because even just having this conversation now with the two of us and anybody listening, it's brought new ideas and new thoughts to your awareness. Like you're going to go home and hug your kid a little bit differently tonight. You might decide, I don't need to watch that extra show tonight. I really am tired. I do need some sleep. You might just choose to put yourself first a little bit more, And it's all those little baby steps, those little baby awarenesses and those changes that eventually lead to being a new you. And so, yeah, I haven't met anybody that I've gone through this process with or anybody that I've even talked to about this that hasn't in one way or another come to me later and said, wow, you really sparked something. That totally changed my perspective on whatever it is. So yeah, it's a super rewarding thing to do. I feel so honored to be in this place right now. I mentioned to you the other day on the phone, I just recently wrote a blog post called In the Stream. And by that, I just mean being so in the river of life, being in the flow where I'm taking action to get there, but I'm not paddling upstream anymore. Well, so much of my life felt like it was a trudge to get through, and it was just, you get through the entire week to make it to the weekend, and then Monday starts again, and just, and fighting hard for the things that you think you want, where you're just like, this is my goal, I'm going to get it no matter what. And when roadblocks are put in your way, I'm not saying we don't have to overcome them, but maybe sometimes it's pulling back and realizing maybe these roadblocks are here for a reason. Maybe I don't need to try quite so hard. Maybe when I'm where I'm supposed to be, it's not difficult,
Yeah, we're not pushing or forcing our way into the world and our way ahead. And as you acknowledged, we'll experience and encounter obstacles, but we relate to those obstacles differently, and potentially see them, as the Stoics have said, as the way. The obstacle can be the way sometimes. Yeah, that's beautiful. And I think both you and I would say to our listeners, and affirm again for ourselves, the more we embrace our mortality, the more courageously and consciously we embrace our mortality, the more we live. And that's counter to everything that's hardwired within we humans, because we find the reality of our mortality deeply abhorrent and something to be avoided at all costs. And the bitter irony of that is that it does us great harm when we avoid the reality of our mortality. And it does us and all whom we know and love great good when we're willing to consciously embrace it and find fresh motivation and focus and energy for life. What do you hope that we all take away from today's conversation?
The word connection comes up over and over for me. And in a time of, we're coming out of COVID and we've become even more isolated than we were before, walking around or sitting on a public transportation or wherever, everybody's looking down at a screen. Be present, be with the people that you are with when you are with them, and genuinely connect. Because you have no idea what that connection is providing for the other person. And you have no idea what you can gain from that connection when you open up and surrender to that moment of it. And so for me, it's all about that. It's how do we be as present as possible with each other as much as possible. My tagline for my business is walking home together, because I think that's all this whole thing is, and so it's like, how do we walk each other home well?
I really like that view of our story in this world. It's not grow up, get a job, have a family, and die. We're walking on a journey together from its observable beginning to its observable conclusion, understanding that there's much more going on than what we can observe. I love that. How can our listeners connect with you?
So I have a website. I am at deathdouladanielle.com. I'm also on LinkedIn, just with my name, Danielle Slupesky. Those are the places you can get a hold of me.
That's great. And I hope that many of our listeners will do just that, to connect with you and learn from you and benefit from your compassionate services. Everybody listening, remember, you are going to die, but you're not dead yet. So wake up and get after it. What stuck with you from Danielle's story? Insight plus action equals transformation. What's one thing you could do today to apply action to your insight so that it can produce the fruit of transformation in your life? The Graveyard Group is like end-of-life coaching with the support of your very own confidential board of advisors. Harness the power of the mortality mindset to break free from the status quo, become the person you are made to be, and live the life you are made to live with guts, gusto, and abandon. As Danielle pointed out, when we bring our mortality to the forefront of our awareness and begin planning for a conscious death, we automatically begin to lead more conscious lives. New groups for men and women are forming now. To learn more, visit andrewpettycoach.com to schedule a free 1-hour coaching session with me. Find me on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn at Andrew Petty Coach, or email me at andrew@andrewpettycoach.com. I'm so glad you tuned in today. Don't forget to follow this show, and I'll see you next time on Andrew Petty is Dying.